Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because what Sweden has just delivered to Ukraine is not simply another weapons transfer. It is not another line item in a foreign aid package, and it is certainly not the routine military assistance that the headlines are framing it as. What Sweden has done, quietly and with surgical deliberation, is hand Ukraine the precise instrument capable of dismantling the single most important strategic advantage that Vladimir Putin has spent 2 decades building and 2 years deploying over the killing fields of Eastern Europe. And most people watching the news tonight do not yet understand the depth of what that means. Let us be precise. Sweden has transferred the Saab Gripen-compatible air defense integration package alongside an expanded delivery of its NLA-DU anti-armor systems, its RBS 70 nanograms man-portable air defense missiles, and crucially, the long-delayed authorization of KEPD 350 Taurus-equivalent cruise munitions coordinated through a joint Nordic framework. The details matter here. The KEPD 350 system carries a warhead capable of penetrating hardened, deeply buried command infrastructure. The RBS 70 nanograms reaches altitudes of 5 kilometers and engages targets at a range of 9 kilometers, with a kill probability that NATO assessors have rated in exercises at above 87% against low-flying helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. And when you layer this on top of what Ukraine already operates, the American NASAMS, the German Iris-T, the French Crotal, the British Starstreak, you begin to understand that something fundamental has shifted, something that cannot be undone. Before we go any further, if the kind of analysis you are receiving right now, layered, historical, structural, and honest, is the kind of analysis you believe the world needs more of, then subscribe now, because what follows in this video is going to take us somewhere the mainstream coverage will not go for another 3 months. Now let us reject the frame that most commentators are operating inside, because the popular framing is dangerously incomplete. The popular frame says this is about escalation. It says Sweden's decision raises tensions, provokes Moscow, crosses some invisible line, and risks a broader war. That frame sounds serious and balanced, but it is in fact a frame constructed entirely from the Russian strategic communication playbook, and if you accept it uncritically, you will misunderstand not only this moment, but the entire logic of how this war has been conducted from the very first week of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. The real question is not whether Sweden's delivery escalates anything. The real question is whether Russia's air power was the last structural pillar of a military strategy that has already failed in every other dimension, and what happens to that strategy when that final pillar collapses. Let us now do what this channel exists to do. Let us pull the lens back and go layer by layer into the structural architecture of this moment. The first layer is what Russian air power actually was at the start of this war, and why it was supposed to make the whole operation functionally painless. When Russian armored columns crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24, 2022, the Kremlin's operational doctrine rested on a principle drawn directly from the American and NATO playbook of the 1991 Gulf War and the 2003 invasion of Iraq: suppress the enemy air defense, achieve air superiority within 72 hours, and use that superiority to paralyze the enemy's command and control, logistics, and will to resist. Russia's VKS, its aerospace forces, comprised on paper approximately 1,200 combat aircraft, including the Su-35S, the Su-34 strike variant, and the Su-57 next-generation stealth platform. Russian doctrine writers in Moscow believed, as recently as January 2022, that Ukrainian air defenses, then composed primarily of aging Soviet-era S-300 systems and Buk M1 batteries, would be destroyed or degraded within the first 48 hours of coordinated cruise missile and airstrike operations. That was the assumption. That was the plan. And that assumption was catastrophically wrong, for reasons that took the entire Western strategic community a full 18 months to properly diagnose. The second layer is how and why Russia failed to achieve air superiority in the first place, which is the hidden foundation of everything that Sweden's delivery now accelerates. By March 7, 2022, just 11 days into the invasion, it was already clear to analysts at the Royal United Services Institute in London, at the Rand Corporation in Washington, and at the Swedish Defence Research Agency FOI in Stockholm that Russia's air campaign had fundamentally stalled. The VKS was not pressing deep into Ukrainian airspace. Russian pilots were flying extraordinarily low, below 500 feet in many documented cases, to avoid engagement envelopes. Why? Because Ukraine had not simply preserved its Soviet-era air defenses, it had dispersed them, concealed them, used decoys, and most importantly, it had received an early warning integration system from the United States in 2021 that allowed its battery commanders to turn radars on for seconds, fire, and turn them off before Russian anti-radiation missiles could lock and prosecute. The kill chain that Russia needed to execute was broken at its most critical node, the targeting data chain, before the war even began in earnest. And Russia has never recovered from that original failure. The third layer is the economic and industrial dimension, which is where Sweden's decision lands with its sharpest strategic edge. By the end of fiscal year 2023, Russia had expended, according to estimates compiled by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and independently verified by Ukrainian military intelligence assessments, cross-referenced with satellite imagery, somewhere between 800 and 900 cruise missiles, more than 1,300 Shahed 136 and Shahed 131 Iranian-supplied loitering munitions, and a staggering volume of glide bombs, modified Fab 500 and Fab 1500 series unguided bombs, fitted with the UMPK glide kit, in quantities exceeding 65,000 units deployed by late 2024. The glide bomb is the key word here. Russia transitioned to glide bombs specifically because cruise missiles are expensive, the production lines are constrained, and caliber missile inventories were being drawn down faster than they could be replenished. The glide bomb is dropped from a Su-34 at altitude, outside most legacy air defense envelopes, and glides to its target unpowered. It costs approximately $25,000 per unit. It is the weapon of a military that has lost its ability to fight a precision air war and has substituted volume for accuracy. And it is precisely this weapon system, the Su-34 carrying Fab series glide bombs, that Sweden's RBS 70 nanograms and the broader integrated air defense architecture now directly threatens. The fourth layer is the human geography of where this matters most, which is the Zaporizhia and Kherson frontline corridors and the critical logistics nodes in the occupied territories. The Su-34 fleet, currently estimated at approximately 140 to 150 operational airframes after confirmed losses of at least 17 aircraft during the conflict, has been operating primarily from Rostov-on-Don, Morozovsk, and Primorsko-Akhtarsk air bases in southern Russia, typically at altitudes between 3 and 8 kilometers on ingress, dropping their glide packages at distances of 50 to 70 kilometers behind the front. The RBS 70 nanograms, now in Ukrainian hands in larger numbers, extends a credible engagement envelope that forces those aircraft to climb higher or stand further back. Both choices degrade accuracy. And when you combine that degradation with the KHPD-class munitions that can now target the forward operating infrastructure, the fuel depots, the weapons transfer facilities, the radar installations, you are not simply adding capabilities at the margins. You are compressing the operational space inside which the Russian air arm can function. The fifth layer is the geopolitical signal that Sweden's decision sends, which is perhaps the most consequential dimension of all, and the one most systematically ignored by the Western press. Sweden formally joined NATO on March 7, 2024, becoming the 32nd member of the alliance after a 22-month ratification process that required Hungary and Turkey to be brought along with considerable diplomatic effort. But Sweden's accession was not merely symbolic. Sweden brings to NATO the most sophisticated indigenous fighter aircraft program outside the United States, the Gripen EF, a world-class radar and electronic warfare industry centered on Saab, and a defense industrial base that has been operating at near wartime production tempo since the spring of 2022. Sweden's decision to transfer the systems it has now transferred is not the decision of a nervous neutral tiptoeing toward commitment. It is the decision of a full alliance member that has made a strategic calculation that Russia's defeat in Ukraine is a Swedish national security interest of the first order, and that the time for symbolic gestures has ended. The sixth and final structural layer is the most uncomfortable one for those who still believe this war can be frozen and negotiated from a position of Russian strength. Russia's air superiority, never fully achieved, always partial, always contested, was the last credible claim that the Kremlin could make about strategic leverage over the battlefield. Its land forces have suffered catastrophic attrition. Independent assessments from Oryx, the open-source intelligence platform that uses confirmed photographic documentation of equipment losses, placed Russian armored vehicle losses at over 3,000 tanks, more than 7,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and more than 2,000 artillery pieces as of early 2025. The manpower mathematics are worse still. The Ukrainian General Staff, cross-referenced with partial Russian official casualty acknowledgements and with medical system data that has leaked through regional Russian journalists, suggests total Russian casualties, killed and seriously wounded, approaching 350,000 personnel. The army that entered Ukraine in February 2022 no longer structurally exists. What exists in its place is a heavily mobilized, inadequately trained, poorly equipped, and increasingly demoralized force that requires air power as a force multiplier because it cannot win through infantry and armor alone. Remove that multiplier, and you remove the Kremlin's last instrument of operational initiative. Now let us apply the historical lens, because history is not decoration here. It is the blueprint. What is happening in Ukraine in 2024 and 2025 is not without precedent. It belongs to a pattern that serious students of military history have seen before, and the precedents are instructive because they show us not only what happens when air power is neutralized, but how quickly a military's entire strategic posture can collapse once that neutralization is complete. Consider the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. In the opening 48 hours of that conflict, Egypt and Syria deployed an unprecedented density of Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile systems, the SA-6 Gainful, the SA-7 Grail, and the ZSU-23-4 Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, along the Suez Canal and Golan Heights front lines. Israel's Air Force, which had been the decisive instrument of the 1967 Six-Day War, was effectively grounded over the forward battle area. In the first 3 days alone, Israel lost approximately 40 aircraft, more than 10% of its frontline strength, to these systems. The loss rate was unsustainable, and without air support, Israeli ground forces found themselves in a brutal attritional struggle that nearly broke the IDF's reserves. It took 2 weeks and the emergency resupply of advanced American munitions, Operation Nickelgrass, which began on October 14, 1973, to restore the balance. The lesson of October 1973 is this: air power, once lost, does not simply reduce effectiveness. It can cause a complete collapse of operational tempo that no ground force can compensate for. Move forward to the Falklands conflict of April through June 1982. Argentina possessed a small but credible air arm, A-4 Skyhawks, super-etendards armed with Exocet missiles, and used it with considerable skill and courage against the British Naval Task Force. But Argentina's pilots were operating at the absolute edge of their fuel range, with no aerial refueling, minimal electronic warfare support, and against an integrated British air defence system that, while imperfect, was layered. The result was predictable. In retrospect, Argentina's air arm was bled white over 6 weeks, losing at least 35 aircraft and the irreplaceable pilots who flew them, while British ground forces were able to land, consolidate, and advance because the air threat, though never eliminated, was degraded below the threshold at which it could prevent combined arms operations. The Falklands tells us something else important. A nation whose air force is being ground down in a war of attrition faces a psychological and institutional breaking point that is more damaging than any single tactical defeat. And then there is the most directly relevant precedent of all, the one that should be on every strategic planner's desk tonight. Operation Desert Storm, January 17 to February 28, 1991. In 39 days of air operations, before a single coalition ground soldier crossed the border into Iraqi-held Kuwait, the United States-led coalition flew 112,000 combat sorties, destroyed Iraq's integrated air defense network, and rendered the Iraqi Air Force, 150,000 personnel, 900 combat aircraft, the fourth largest air force in the world at the time, functionally irrelevant. By the time the ground war began on February 24, 1991, the 100-hour campaign that followed was not a war, it was a harvest. The Iraqi army, deprived of air cover, accurate intelligence, and functioning logistics, collapsed in exactly 96 hours. The historical verdict is unambiguous. When you destroy an adversary's air power and air defense integration, you do not weaken it. You end its ability to wage war as a coherent military enterprise. Russia is not Iraq. That is a necessary and honest qualification. Russia possesses nuclear weapons, a hardened industrial base, a large manpower reserve, and a political leadership that has demonstrated its willingness to accept enormous losses. These are real and important distinctions. But the underlying military logic, that a ground force stripped of credible air power loses its decisive instrument, operates regardless of the size or the nuclear status of the power in question. Now let us examine the strategic consequences more precisely. The first and most immediate consequence is a compression of Russia's forward air operating radius. If Ukrainian RBS 70 nanograms batteries, supported by NATO-provided radar integration, and the expanded NATO ISR architecture that has been quietly deepening since 2023, can engage targets at 9 kilometers altitude and 9 kilometers range in a hemispherical engagement volume, then Russian air operations must begin their attack profiles from a minimum standoff distance that significantly degrades the CEP, the circular error probable, of their glide bomb deliveries. Current assessments suggest that at 70 kilometers standoff, FAB 500 UMPK accuracy degrades from a CEP of approximately 3 to 5 meters to 20 to 30 meters. At 90 kilometers standoff, that figure approaches 50 meters. The weapon that was being used to devastate Ukrainian frontline fortifications and population centers with terrifying precision becomes, at sufficient standoff, a blunt instrument of area denial rather than a precision strike capability. The second consequence is institutional and psychological, and it may be the more powerful of the two. The Russian VKS has lost, by documented confirmed assessments, at least 92 aircraft since February 2022, including at least 17 Su-34s, 14 Su-25s, and a number of Su-35 and Su-30 airframes. These losses are replaceable in the long run. What is not replaceable on a short timeline is the trained aircrew. A competitive fighter pilot requires a minimum of 300 to 500 hours of advanced flight training beyond basic instruction, a process that takes 3 to 5 years under ideal conditions. Russia's military aviation training pipeline was already under stress before the war. The losses of experienced crews since 2022 have created an experience gap that no accelerated training program can bridge before the window of this war closes. What Sweden's systems do is widen that gap further. Every additional Su-34 crew that is lost over Ukrainian territory is an institutional loss that compounds across the entire VKS for the next decade. The third consequence is the signal to China, to Iran, to North Korea, and to every other actor that has been supplying Russia with the material it needs to sustain this campaign. China has been watching this war with the intensity of a doctoral student watching a live experiment in modern combined arms warfare. Beijing's military leadership has been paying specific attention to the performance of Russian air defenses, Russian cruise missile strikes, and the Western-supplied counter-architecture that has degraded them. What Sweden's contribution to that architecture signals is that the Western alliance, far from fragmenting under the pressure of electoral uncertainty and economic fatigue, has found a second operational gear. The Nordic states, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, are now collectively spending at levels that approach or exceed 2% of GDP on defense, contributing equipment of genuine lethality, and doing so with the institutional discipline and industrial quality that distinguishes a serious defense culture from a performative one. That signal matters in Beijing's calculations about Taiwan in ways that are not yet reflected in the public commentary. Now let us sketch the scenario space, because intellectual honesty requires us to acknowledge that multiple futures remain possible, even as the structural logic we have examined points in a clear direction. Scenario 1 is continued attrition convergence, which is the most probable near-term trajectory. In this scenario, Russia continues to absorb the progressive degradation of its air arm, continues to rely on ground-launched missile systems and Shahed drones as partial substitutes, and continues to trade territorial inches for enormous human cost. Ukraine, bolstered by Sweden's systems and the broader Western resupply pipeline, stabilizes its front lines, denies Russia the breakthrough it requires to collapse the political will of Western supporters, and grinds toward a negotiating position from a posture of increasing strategic strength. This scenario does not produce a decisive Ukrainian offensive in the short term, but it produces something more strategically durable, a Russia that is militarily exhausted and industrially strained, facing a negotiation table at which its leverage is diminishing by the quarter. Scenario 2 is Russian escalatory substitution. In this scenario, Moscow responds to the progressive neutralization of its conventional air arm by accelerating its use of ballistic missiles, the Iskander-M, the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, and by deepening its partnership with North Korea for additional artillery ammunition and potentially ballistic missile components. This scenario is already partially underway. North Korea has supplied Russia with an estimated 3 million artillery shells since 2023, and the Kinzhal has been used in at least 17 confirmed strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure. But this scenario also has an internal constraint. Ballistic missiles are expensive, production limited, and cannot substitute for the tactical density that the air arm provides. Scenario 3 is a negotiated pause under external pressure, particularly from a changed American political posture following the 2024 election. In this scenario, Western support levels are conditioned on a Ukrainian willingness to enter ceasefire discussions from whatever territorial position exists at the moment of maximum political pressure. Sweden's contribution in this scenario takes on a different significance. It becomes part of the argument that Ukraine's allies have invested too much political and material capital to accept an outcome that ratifies Russian aggression. The Nordic states, as the most exposed European members of the alliance, would be the most vocal opponents of any settlement that does not include genuine security guarantees. Scenario 4 is the most speculative, but historically the most instructive. It is the scenario in which Russia's military and political elites, confronted with the compound failure of the air campaign, the ground campaign, the economic campaign, and the information campaign, begin the internal recalculation that precedes regime adjustment. History tells us that military regimes under sustained strategic failure do not simply absorb the pressure indefinitely. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1988 and 1989 was preceded by precisely this kind of internal elite recalculation, a gradual recognition that the costs of continuity exceeded the costs of change. We are not yet at that threshold in Russia, but we are for the first time in this conflict beginning to see the contours of a trajectory that points toward it. And here is the civilizational warning with which every honest analysis of this moment must close, because this war is not only about Ukraine and Russia. It is about the architecture of the international order that was built after 1945, tested after 1989, and is now being contested in its most fundamental terms on the frozen ground of Eastern Europe. What Sweden has done by delivering these systems is not simply a military act, it is a civilizational statement. It is the statement of a small Nordic democracy that spent 75 years in careful neutrality, watched the post-war security order be built by others, and made the quiet calculation that neutrality is a privilege that only survives when someone else is paying for the security that makes it possible. Sweden's journey to NATO membership, and now its direct material contribution to Ukraine's survival, is the story of a society that looked honestly at what Russian revanchism means for the long-term security of Northern Europe, and decided that the time for polite distance had ended. The deeper lesson, and it is a lesson that applies to every democracy that is watching this conflict from a comfortable distance tonight, is that the architecture of international order is not self-sustaining. It is sustained by those who are willing to pay the cost of maintaining it, in resources, in political courage, and occasionally in blood. Sweden has chosen to pay part of that cost tonight. The question for every other democracy watching is whether they understand, in time, what the bill will look like if they choose not to. If what you heard tonight challenged your assumptions, deepened your understanding of the hidden architecture behind this war, or showed you something that the evening headlines will not, then subscribe for ongoing analysis, because the next question this channel will examine is whether Finland's decision on long-range strike capability is about to do to Russian Baltic Sea dominance what Sweden has just done to Russian air power over Ukraine. And the answer, as you might suspect, is far more consequential than anyone in official Washington is currently willing to say publicly. Leave a comment below with your answer to this question. Which country, in your assessment, delivers the most strategically decisive contribution to Ukraine's defense over the next 12 months? Sweden, Finland, Germany, or France? The answers may surprise you. And this conversation is just beginning.